This is the Aeneid, section 4, line 721 to 740, the analysis. The first thing we're going to pick up on is a little bit of a funny one. So we have subjecta up here and succedo here. Now, although those verbs look quite different, they have the same prefix in front of them. So the prefix is sub. In that second verb, it's obviously changed. The B has changed to a C. That quite often happens when you add a prefix to another word. But the point is that this is repetition of the word sub, which means under. And that's because this moment is describing Aeneas putting himself under the lion's skin and then putting himself under the burden, which is his dad, which is oneri, next to succedoque there. And the whole point is that it's highlighting this image of Aeneas loading himself up with all these things that he needs to carry. He has a big responsibility here. So it highlights the image of Aeneas taking on the burden. And that's the repetition of sub. We've got some nice enclosing word order as well. So fulvi leonis, which is the tawny lion. And those words are on either side of in sternal, which is the verb that describes Aeneas. So I covered. So if Aeneas is represented here by this verb, then that means the enclosing word order of the tawny lion creates an image of the lion skin enclosing Aeneas himself going around his shoulders. As you can see on line 724, this is a very dactylic line, and that's because at this point we're having the movements of Iulus described. So the short, quick sounds are supposed to represent his short, quick, tiny little frantic footsteps as he tries to keep up with his dad and all the other adults around him. On the following line, firstly, very straightforward, we've got ferime, which is historic present. We translated it as we were carried. It literally says we are carried, so the historic present obviously makes that very vivid. And on the line after that, we move from dactyls to spondes. Okay, so at this point, Aeneas is now talking about how he used to not be afraid of the Greeks. He was unmoved by the Greeks' weapons. They didn't scare him. And the spondes here mean that he slows that bit of his speech down. So this is a very spondaic line, because if you wanted to say something that people listen to and that people remember, you would say it slower. You might repeat yourself to highlight it. So this emphasizes, as most things do, Aeneas's previous bravery, because he wasn't scared. He was unmoved by all those weapons of the Greeks when he was fighting in the Trojan War. So he's showing off a little bit here, and he exaggerates that by slowing everything down. Slightly more interestingly, on line 727 is the use of these two words, glomerati examine. Now, we translated this as something like gathered into a mass, or massed together, or grouped together, or something like that. But we're going to talk a little bit here about what these words literally mean. So glomerati literally means form, and formed because it's a PPP, into a ball. And examine is actually a swarm of bees. So that means that the words that Virgil's using here is a metaphor, because he's describing these Greeks as a swarm of bees massed together in a big ball. And that highlights the threat of the Greeks, and therefore the bravery of Aeneas himself, because he's saying, I wasn't scared of them, even when they were gathered into a massive big ball of bees. And the reason that he's saying this is because now that he's responsible for this group of Trojans and they're attempting to leave Troy, and he's got his dad on his back and his son by his side and his wife following on behind, now is the moment when he's become scared, because he then says, now even the breezes are scaring me. Every tiny sound I'm terrified of, because he's got more of a responsibility. And this is highlighted in several ways. Firstly, the repetition of omnes and omnis highlights how everything is scaring him. He's terrified of everything. Secondly, we've got terent and exitat, both as historic present. So terent we translated as I was terrified, and exitat we translated as scared. They literally mean they terrify me and they scare me. So they're in the present tense. So we've got historic presence here. That's exactly the colour that I wanted. We've got historic presence and repetition of omnes. Okay, so all the sounds are terrifying him, and it's very vivid because it's written in the present tense. On the following line, for the same reasons, so to show just how scared he is, firstly we have repetition of que, because these are the two things that he's worried about. These aren't the things that he's scared of. These are the things that he's worried about. He's worried about his comity, his comrades, which is his son, and his onery, his burden, which is his dad. So again, we've got repetition to highlight the things that he's worried about. And also, Virgil has placed suspensum, which we translated as hesitated or wavering, and timentem as fearing. He's put the adjectives on either end of the line, and they both describe Aeneas. They both describe how scared he is. So those two adjectives are emphatically positioned at each end of the line to show how panicked and how terrified he now is, now that he has this responsibility. Carrying on line 730, this is the moment when Aeneas and his fellow Trojans are approaching the gates, and just after this is when his dad notices that some enemy are approaching and that they're actually in danger. On line 730, we have repetition of P, and also Q. And the P and the Q are harsh sounds, and they're supposed to show Aeneas's panic. So alliteration, or at least his fear. These highlight Aeneas's fear, because it's a fearful sound. You can imagine his teeth chattering away and him shaking as he's nervous because he thinks they're about to get to the gate. He thinks that they might be safe, and he's just worried about what might happen. But then, on line 731, subito suddenly appears. So just after the pause, it appears before the come clause. And obviously the word suddenly is supposed to create panic for the reader. It's supposed to create panic for anyone who's remotely involved in this situation. So the word subito suddenly appears straight after the pause and creates suspense and panic. And on the next line, as you can see, it's very dactylic because this is the moment when he suddenly hears a noise. He thinks he can hear the sound of feet, and his dad's about to say, we need to get out of here. So the dactyls, the dactylic line, create this panic as suddenly they can hear the enemy approaching. The other thing that happens here to create a bit of panic is sibilance. So it starts with subito auris on the previous line, and then when we suddenly hear the sound of feet, it's all the way through this line here. So the sibilance, the sound of S, is not how you spell it, sorry. Also creates the sound of the threat. So just as they hear the enemy approaching, there's a sound running all the way through. In keeping with that, on the next line, we've got some P sounds. So instead of sibilance here, we have alliteration of P. And again, This is just panic. This is as Anchises, Aeneas's dad, realizes what's happening, realizes that the enemy are approaching, and shouts at him to flee. And the P sounds highlight and reflect that panic, as well as the repetition of the word nate. So he calls out to his son twice. So we hear the panic in Anchises' voice here as well. And not only does that create panic, it also shows us how strongly Anchises feels about his son. A lot of you mentioned previously how there's this strong bond between Anchises and Aeneas, and here we see that in action. On line 734, we have a nice little bit of chiasmus. So we have ardentes, an adjective, klipeos, a noun, ira, a noun, and then mekantia, an adjective. So this is what Anchises describes, that he can see. He sees glowing shields and flashing bronze. And remember, chiasmus just always draws our attention to something. You never get something insignificant written in chiasmus. It's always going to be something important. And the reason that our attention is drawn to this is because this is the threat of the enemy. This is the most terrifying thing that they could possibly see. So it draws our attention to the threat. Okay. And then in line 735 to 736, we have the moment where we're told that some unfriendly divine power has snatched away Aeneas's confused mind. So he's suddenly at a loss what to do. He's confused. He doesn't really know what's going on. There's a lot of doom and gloom in this moment because we know what's coming next. And the way in which Virgil highlights that is through his classic use of gloomy sounds, so M's and ends. There is no denying here that these lines are covered in M's and ends, and that creates a sense of impending doom. Okay. On the following lines, there's not a lot to mention analysis-wise. Obviously, relevant stuff to pick out if you were ever to get this passage to comment on, or just exactly what's going on, how he follows the byways, he runs around, he checks the roads, and it's all very chaotic and panicked. And also the exclamatory in line 738, heyu, which we translate as something like alas, shows Aeneas's panic as he tries to look for Creusa. And also, obviously, a significant moment here is when her name is emphatically positioned at the end of the line. Finally, Creusa gets the attention she deserves. So she's emphatically positioned because this is who Aeneas has now lost. This is who Aeneas is now focusing on. So it reflects the focus of Aeneas on his wife. And finally, in line 739, we get 3 verbs just in that one line, which is quite a lot, which we translated as something like stopped, wandered off, or sat down. And these are the 3 options that Aeneas considers. He doesn't know what's happened to Creusa, so these are the 3 options. And the 3 verbs shows Aeneas's thought process as he thinks through all the options of what could have happened. He's worried. It shows his worry here. Has she done this? Has she done that? Has she done this? He's no idea. He's worried and he's also confused. And the final thing to mention here is the word incertum. This is a lovely example of enjambement because it's been delayed onto the next line just before a pause. And that draws our attention to the fact that this is exactly how he feels. He has no idea where she is. So it reflects his uncertain feelings. And that is when my video is going to run out.